Did you complete? Hello.
You got a slot. Congratulations.
Yes, I did. This was thanks to Charlie on the Discord.
Oh, really?
So yes, so Charlie found that there were slots open, and he couldn't make the reunion, and so he told people, and so I was one of the persons that got
Good reason to be on the Discord.
it. Yes, and thank you, Charlie Campbell.
Thank you, Charlie Campbell. Well, we've spoken before. You've dropped into some of the thief in the night things, but I've never really gotten your story. So why don't we start there?
Okay, that's a big question.
It's
What is
only
my
an
story?
hour.
Okay,
It's
right.
not a problem.
So I recently found that I came into existence because of Dallas Theological Seminary. So both my parents moved to Texas because of this seminary. So my mother's father was a pastor and he went and got his education there. And then my dad came down and his family came down. I don't know exactly why, but he was attending classes there. And they didn't meet at the seminary, but somewhere peripheral to that. And so that's I was talking with I think Hugabumba has some connections to that seminary and some of the other guys in the Protestant chat. Let's see.
So tell me, so sounds like if that's the connection that your parents made, you must have grew up in church.
Yes, I grew up in Bible churches, which
Bible churches.
yes, these are non-denominational churches that all happen to be pastored by guys from DTS.
That's right. For those of you in Europe who don't know that, here in America, and especially in the middle of America, that is known.
Yes, yeah. I remember growing up, and my grandmother, she was excited about the end of the world, and so she had this panorama that she would put on the walls, and it was the story of the ages, the dispensationalist story of the ages. And so it would go through the world and the Bible and history, and it didn't make a firm distinction of when the Bible ended and when more history began. But it would keep going, and then it would continue to now, and then just right in the near future, would talk about here's the rapture, and here's the tribulation, and here's the Jesus is coming back, and there's this war of Gog and Magog, and there's this 1,000 years. And so that my parents are still my grandparents are still very convinced that it's the end of the world. My mother too.
The world is always ending.
This is what I find, yes. Oh dear. So I grew up some and I left America. And so I got involved with YWAM.
Okay.
So I was in Norway for some time. And then I went to France and I've been in France for 4 years now.
Okay.
I'm right now I'm home in America visiting family for Christmas.
Okay. Okay. There's a solid group of YWAMers in that sort of collected here. You know, a few others have made their way through YWAM. Yeah, YWAM, for those of you who are listening who don't know what YWAM is, that's Youth with a Mission, and it's not just youth. It's basically an evangelical mission organization. They have mercy ships. They're a major organization.
They are a very decentralized group, leaderless almost.
Really?
Not leaderless technically, but in the past years they've decentralized even more so. And so it's things really come down to the base leaders and local tribe leaders, which is an interesting idea for what we're kind of doing. And then the central leadership, like the way I have experienced the leadership personally, is more in the role of trusted elders. And they're like, okay, we've got Lauren Cunningham and the rest of the guys are like trusted elders, and when they speak, we definitely listen. But there's not as much organizational control going on as there used to be.
That's interesting. That's very interesting.
And part of it is like no one knows how many YWAMers there are. No one has done a census. So we know that we're big, but we don't know how big.
That's very interesting. Because like again, I haven't known, I knew mercy ships and because they'd come into Barahona and then I'd bump into other YWAMers here and there and now on the internet again. So there seem to be a lot of them, but
Oh yeah, there are.
but I didn't know much about the organization.
Yeah, I think yeah, it's gotten less. And for day-to-day life in YWAM, organization above base level is not it's not a how you experience it, or at
Yeah.
least me personally.
Okay. Okay. So tell me about what you're doing with YWAM in France.
Well, I left them this past year,
Okay.
and now I'm trying to break into university.
Oh,
So I've moved to the other side of France, and I'm yeah. But there's been speed road bumps with that, but I'm still working on it.
okay. So it's going to be campus ministry type stuff, or
I don't have plans for ministry right now.
okay.
I have plans to try to build a normal life, but like I can't stay out of ministry very long because like that's what all my friends are doing. And so when I have friends and they need help, I always it's not something I don't think I'm ever going to escape from. But it's not like a big thing that I'm trying to do.
Okay. How are you eating?
How am I eating? I've taken long trips back to America and I work as hard as I can when I'm in America and make as much money.
Okay.
That's not a great system, and it's part of why I'm trying to integrate into a more regular French life because like there's ways to exist even if I can't work yet.
Do you have working papers in France or not?
I don't have working papers. I have the hope of getting those relatively soon, like within
Okay.
the next couple of years.
Okay. Okay. You're what kind of a visa are you on?
Uh, basically, carte de séjour, like a I don't know if there's an American equivalent, but basically I can stay there and I have temporary residence that I renew every year.
Okay. 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 Yeah. Yeah. People don't realize with foreign missionaries, there's a lot of these little details and things that are always going on. And once you've done it, you begin to realize that these things do matter. Are you in the country legally or illegally? You Because in the Dominican Republic, we first went there on a tourist visa, which allows you to stay like 3 months. And then if you overstay your tourist visa, you have to pay a fine of like $20 American. It was just a way for the government to get hard currency. And
Oh wow.
so then after a while, but to get a visa, a regular visa takes time because the government doesn't work well, and so you do all these things. But
There are times in which it seems like visas are the most important thing in life.
this is true. This is true. Well, what did you
Oh
want to
man.
talk? What did you want to talk about?
Well, I didn't know, but then I came up with a question.
Okay,
And my question is, what are a couple of stories where you've experienced hospitality?
where I've experienced what?
Hospitality.
Oh, where I've experienced hospitality. An easy one is um worshiping with Haitians in the Dominican Republic,
Ooh.
because I would so I part of my job was working with sort of the local leadership in the region of the country in the DR where I was living. So some of the pastors who made up sort of a ministry team, they called it the Mesa, which was basically the table, the Mesa for the zone. And so we'd had monthly meetings with them where there'd be little programs and we'd have to talk about what was going on between the pastors or in the churches. It's just basically helping to manage the church in that region. But then on Sundays, I would go out and visit the churches. And, I hadn't actually thought about this in this way now, given because I did the missionary work and then I've been pastoring a local church for 20 years before the YouTube thing started. And then now with the YouTube thing, there are echoes of the celebrity thing, both from being a foreign missionary, like a white North American pastor amidst illegal Haitians in the Dominican Republic, and also now with the estuary thing and being a being of light on YouTube and all this kind of thing. So I would, every Sunday I would go up into the either out into the cane fields or up into the mountains. Those are the two areas that we had churches in around Barahona, and I would visit the churches. And when I would visit the churches, this was always we had about I don't know, there are about 35 groups in the area. So, 52 Sundays a year. And then I would, I would just do random visits before, and then I got kind of sick of that. So I had a program where I would visit one church every Sunday for a month. And that was really good to kind of get to know the church a little bit and have them to get to know me a little bit. And then because I was living in the Dominican Republic, I was working in Spanish, but many of the people their handle on Spanish wasn't great. So I would bring a friend who was fluent both in Spanish and Creole. He was Haitian, but he had legal papers in the DR. And so he would travel with me. And that was great fun because we then got to build a relationship.
Did you learn any Creole?
I didn't. There are most of the other missionaries did, because the main focus, say I was only there 6 years. So
Okay.
you learn Spanish right away. And
Hmm.
many of the people, the pastors that I worked with, they all knew Spanish because the pastors had been in the country longer. And so day to day, I just lived in Spanish and worked. And
Okay.
the business of the church was for the most part done in Spanish. But Creole, the further you got away from towns and the more over the border the people were, there was Creole. So I didn't wind up learning much Creole. Some of the other missionaries who had been there longer did. And some of the other missionaries who were, say, better at foreign languages than I was did pick it up quite quickly.
Hmm.
So I worked with this guy, and we'd travel around together, and he'd translate my, knowing what I knew of him just in terms of our own Spanish conversations. I really wonder how much of what I said he understood. I remember he was a school teacher, and he see, now you got me telling missionary stories. This is a really dangerous thing because you signed up for an hour and I'm going to blab the whole time. Anyway, your question was about hospitality. So week after week, I would go to these little churches, and of course, when I would come, everyone from these small local communities, often, some big white guy drives up in a vehicle, and there's not a lot of things to do in these little places. And so everybody comes out of the woodwork. Something's happening here. And, see the strange man with the beard. My beard wasn't white then. It was dark, and I had hair. See the strange man with the beard and hear him butcher Spanish, and, figure out what on earth the Creole is going to be of this thing. And but then we would be in church 3-4 hours. That was kind of a standard Sunday morning, especially when I showed up. And then after the church service, we would have a meal. And these were very poor people. I mean, these people were poor by Dominican standards.
Hmm.
And because I was coming, they would pull out all the stops and basically cook a big meal for the community. Some of the best food I've ever eaten were in those
Mm.
communities, which is incredible to think about. Because again, these were very poor people, and it was usually rice and maybe some fish or some chicken. But it was, it was cooked for hours over a charcoal fire, by people who didn't have a lot, but knew how to use what they had. And so then I remember on one, so my father would come out sometimes, when my mother and father would visit us there. My father would come out, and I'd take him to church because he loved it. He loved getting out there, and because, he was also high in openness. So he loved going out with me, and we'd get out there, and then you'd sit down. And because I was in some ways the celebrity, I was, they always made me sit in front, which sort of embarrassed me. And, they fawned over me, and they buttered me up, and, all this kind of stuff. And then, of course, at the end of the thing, then they'd sit me down in probably the best table and chair that they could muster. And they'd put a big heaping pile of food in front of me. And
Hmm.
especially in my younger days, I could eat a lot. Um,
How tall are you?
I'm a little over 6'4".
Okay, yes.
So I could eat a lot. And I was a young man. And so, there was no end to what I could eat. But so my father was also a big eater. He was the same size as me. I'm in some ways sort of a duplicate of my father. And I remember he's sitting there and he's chowing down. I said, now, Dad, just eat enough to let the people know you really are enjoying it and appreciating it, but then stop. And of course, for us, we think, well, why would you stop? That food would go to waste because, waste not, want not, all these values. But what would happen is when I would stop eating, they would take the plate, and then the plate would then get passed on down the pecking order. And so
Oh,
if
wow.
me who eats multiple times a day, if I would sit there and eat all that food, there's a whole bunch of people who don't eat multiple times a day who wouldn't have that food. And
I was ta-
that's hospitality.
hmm. That reminds me, I was talking with a friend of mine, and she had both done missions work both in Europe and Africa. And she's French, and she was talking about in Africa, her experience of poverty is that poverty brings you together and connects you to the people around you. And in South Africa, if you're rich, you're isolated.
Yep.
But if you're poor, you're connected.
Yep.
And she had also experienced poverty in France, and I think all across the West, poverty isolates you. When you're poor in the West, you're pushed out of community and you're pushed out of society. And if you're rich, that allows you to connect to society. And
Yeah.
yeah, in some ways, it makes being poor in the West a very different experience to being poor in other countries.
Yes and no, because my experience with the homeless here in the West is that, like, it's so complex, but I've known street culture. There's kind of sort of two layers. There's sort of, street culture is a different world than the normies or the civilians.
Hmm.
And in street culture, there is something like the communion of poverty that I saw in the third world.
Yeah.
I've seen homeless people be incredibly generous with each other and me. So I would think that some of the best hospitality I have ever received has been from the poor, both in the Dominican Republic and in terms of street culture, where I mean it's strange. It's strange to say. I mean, I've seen homeless people give that they really do develop sort of this the birds of the air neither sow nor reap. That really does develop in extreme poverty, because one way or another they know that they live in so much chaos, they can't store anything, and so they really do live hand to mouth by the grace of God. And that's part of
Wow.
the reason that I don't know any atheist street people.
No, no. Plenty of
They're all
Satanist street
religious. They
people,
got
but
some
not
wacky
atheists.
religions, but they're all religious.
But I guess that connects to there's the Christian, not the Christian ideal of poverty, but the Christian spiritual discipline of poverty. That like I have not seen formally taught around me, but I've experienced with people around me, especially in YWAM. There's substantial amounts of poverty in YWAM.
Yes, yes. YWAM is in some ways has elements of being a Protestant monastic order.
Yes. The difference is they marry each other and they have children, and there are what I see in developing in front of me are like ethnic YWAMers. And they're the kids that grew up on three bases or on base and have three passports. And there's that monastic order to it, but there's also like, wait, monastic, it's a tribe now. Like, what's
Yep.
the difference between a monastic order and a tribe that just develops around the altar?
Yep. Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's really good.
This idea of religion, religio, the binding together, and there's that aspect of it, but like when you have a religion that binds together, you're coming together around something. And basically, the only thing you can really organize around is the presence of God. God manifested in some way, he's present in some way. And then everyone just organized around that. There was a fire that was lit, and everyone just came to the fire. And then the religio aspect is okay, we're all here around this fire. How do we live together? It, yeah, that's part of why I'm probably staying in Europe, and that's part of why even if I'm not in YWAM, I'm still around like the prayer house culture and the prayer house movement because the presence of the Lord is there. Where else can I go?
Wow. Boy, there's so much there. Partly because I know embittered refugees from that space. And
Oh,
I'm
me
sure you
too.
do too. People, and it isn't, it's very much the algorithm has been serving up a Michaela Peterson video to me about cults that I haven't watched. But we've talked about cults to a degree on my channel, from Nick from Santa Cruz and from others. And YWAM is not a cult because in some ways the difference between a cult and a church is that in some ways in a church you have to exert effort to stay in a cult you have to exert a lot of effort to get out. And that doesn't mean that for many people leaving the faith doesn't require effort. It does.
For people who
But
are deconstructing, that is a ton of work, and
yes,
that's a ton of heartache, and that takes serious effort.
but it's different from breaking out of a cult.
Yeah,
because
it would
but
have to
because
be.
in a cult the institution is coercing you to stay inside. And YWAM doesn't do that, but there is, boy, because I know many people who are, and it's not just YWAM, it's children of ministers, and um the more the culture of asceticism within that group is, the more interesting the bitterness about it gets for those who have left. I mean, because what
Yeah.
you just described about, you know, you're in it, and prayer house culture and prayer house movement. I mean, you want to stay, because clearly it's working for you, and it doesn't mean effortlessly. Well,
I
no,
wish it
I'm sure you wish
doesn't
it would
feel like
work
it.
better. I mean, all of us wish things would work better, but that's very different from the exiles and refugees.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought it's interesting in French, they kind of switched the word cult for so a culte is describing a worship service.
Right.
It's probably similar in Spanish. And
Culto.
then
Yep.
sect is like it's what we're talking about with cult.
Right. No, that's right. That's right. It's flipped in English. No, that's good because
Right, but like okay, so a cult, I'm seeing cult as the basis of culture. And
yes.
like so the culture builds around the culto, that it's building around the church. It's building around the thing that happens in the church. And so in some ways I see the difference between cult and society as a difference of degree and not kind. I don't think that there's a categorical difference. There's, you know, in the COVID times, they locked us in the house and they had police on the street patrolling. And if we
Where?
wanted to go,
France?
yes.
Oh, God
If
bless
we wanted,
America.
not just France, many places that
Oh,
weren't
I know
America.
Australia. Yeah.
And so like we would make papers and you would have to carry your paper and you have to sign what time you left your house if you're going to the grocery store and what time you came back. And if you're taking your 30 minutes of exercise, you have to sign in and sign out for that. And so, we would do some business of carrying around 3 or 4 of those papers with different times, and then, but we would also like understand where the police patrolled and where they didn't, and we would move around that. And like, and then there was all the coercion about the vaccine and all of these things, and that felt all very abusive. It just like very, very abusive and manipulative. And there wasn't really a place you could go to escape it. I guess you could go to America, but like it takes serious effort to escape that great cult that was bearing down on us. And even if it's lifted back a little bit, understanding that they did that and will probably do things like that again, it feels like I'm locked in a great open air prison or a giant cult. And like I haven't been in a classical cult, and so I'm sure there's differences, and I haven't experienced those traumas. But I'm looking at that, and I'm looking at cults. It's like this is just competition to the great big cult.
Yeah, I'm sure the Chinese are feeling that way.
Yeah, yeah. I'm seeing some of these videos.
Those poor Chinese.
Oh
No,
man,
that's a good point. That's a good point. But it is, there is something to, there was a real sweetness to the culture of, let's say, the missionary colleagues that I had in the Dominican Republic. Many of us were there was kind of an older group, but then there was a whole group of us that kind of came in at the same time and were about the same age, and we were having children at the same time, and the commonality of the mission and being in it together, and the risk, the adventure, the sacrifice.
shared culture shock, third culture
Third
kids
culture shock. Yep.
learning languages together. Yeah,
Yep. It's bonding, and it's very cohesive for a group. There's the element that were the missionaries, my colleagues that worked for the same mission. And then when I moved to this town, I was the only one of our group that was in this little town. But then there was this tiny little cohort of some, extranjeros, some expats who were living together. One was working in a shrimp farm. Another couple were working with Habitat for Humanity. Another couple were working for a little independent mission that was bringing basically a little medical clinic to a little town outside of the town, that the minor city that I was living in. And and we bonded hard, the 4 couples. Especially the shrimp farmer his life kept being in danger, because the Dominican who ran the outfit lived in Santo Domingo, and he was sort of the boss on site, and there was always tensions between him and the town. And at one point he was robbed and bound and tied, and I mean, he had to have an armed guard after a while. And I mean, it was the Wild West. And all of us were in our 20s, and just having kids, and driving four-wheeling up in just beautiful places along the coast. And it was very romantic in some ways. In terms of, I don't mean romance, but in terms of
yeah,
you get it, and
yes.
it's heady stuff. And the suffering and the community, and no, it was good. And in evangelical churches, missionaries are missionaries are minor celebrities in evangelical churches, even above pastors, because there's the sense that missionaries suffer for the cause in a way that the local pastor doesn't.
Well, it's a different experience, but local pastors suffer.
Oh yeah, everybody suffers. Just
But
suffer in different ways. Missionaries just suffer for the Lord, or at least that's the mystique about it.
well, pastors suffer for the Lord. Being a pastor is hard.
They suffer from the body of Christ.
Yes. Missionaries have a unique experience that in some ways tracks alongside the hero's journey in some ways. Like there's the
Yes.
going out, there's the foreignness,
Yes.
there's all those things that track on to these different kinds of stories that are more recognizable to us.
Yeah. And the call to adventure.
Yeah.
That's, it's all the languages there, calling and yeah, and then of course you come back to North America for your home service. And so my wife, her parents were missionaries in Nigeria in the 1960s. And so when her,
During the
yeah,
war.
yeah.
Okay.
And when her mother died in 2013, um, between her and her brother, we had to sort of divvy up all of the what we call the African stuff. And it was all of this stuff that when they would come home for deputation, they would, they dress up in the Nigerian garb, and they'd
Oh
have
yeah.
the trinkets and the whole classical missionary experience.
My generation doesn't really do this, but you're awakening some memories of when I was a very small child and like there were missionaries coming home and they dressed up and they had things.
There
I must
was
have been like
when I
four or
was
5 years old.
Yeah, when I was still in that work, there were still the fragments of what in the CRC was called the Women's Missionary Union, which of course
Mhm.
harkens back to something that feels very 19th century, where so you'd have a world missions guy, you'd have a home missions guy, and then you'd have a world relief guy. World relief did relief and development, home missions did church planting in the United States, and world missions did, work in churches around the world. And so, Women's Missionary Union, each church would have their own Women's Missionary Union cell in their church. And then we'd come to town. This is again, hospitality. We'd roll into town and we'd do our shtick and show our slides. But of course, it was in the early 90s when I was doing this, in the 90s. And then it was, things were just starting to come into video. And I mean, the world was changing, and also mission work was changing in that North Americans going overseas were in many ways just too expensive to do something like church planting. And
Mhm.
so, increasingly North American missionaries would do specialty work, because why would you spend all of this money sending someone from the United States overseas and having to consider child's education, medical benefits, all of these very costly things to sort of keep that bridge alive, when a national could be a local church pastor in many ways far better than this gringo coming over. So, I mean, this stuff has continued to change as globalization and development has continued to morph around the world. And then, of course, and then in the 90s, a lot more attention began being paid to the re-evangelism of Europe, because increasingly a lot of the places traditionally where North American missionaries would go, Africa, Asia, Latin America. I mean, right now, a whole bunch of Catholics are like,
See, this is our North American Protestantism.
that's right. That's right. But now, African countries. I mean, the other the church that rents from us here, they're Nigerian Anglicans.
That's really cool.
And so yeah, France is a fertile missionary. I don't know how fertile it is. You can tell me
I
that,
wouldn't
but
describe it as fertile, but it's a place.
so yeah, maybe all missions is like going to Latin America from North American Protestants. We're going to
In some ways, that's what it
re-evangelize
is.
France.
Yeah. My grandparents were missionaries in North Africa, in Algeria and Morocco, and they were in some ways based out of France. And some of their old missionary buddies are still there, and so I visit them sometimes. They still live in Marseille. It, but it's France in terms of missionary ground. It feels a lot like a Muslim country, And not just because there's lots of Muslims there, but something about the mindsets and the way the French people think and the way it all works. Like there's a certain hardness of mind that's similar to a Muslim hardness of mind.
Interesting.
It's it's very different than a place like Germany or Belgium or Switzerland. There's a there's something there. And of course, I was always in the Protestant circles, and I'm always trying to stick my head out of the Protestant circles and see what the Catholics are up to. I was living in Paris for some time, and I was attending a Latin mass there in meetings with people, and that was a good experience. It's a of course, like the local church is different than missionary circles, and there's different kinds of concerns. And in some ways, there were similarities to Protestant churches that I would go to, but that was really neat. And like how I would love to get more of an insider's view in how the Roman Catholics see evangelizing Europe, because like I've seen it from a Protestant perspective, and especially an evangelical perspective. But in a traditionally Catholic country like France, how do Roman Catholics see evangelizing France? Or whatever they're or catechizing France, or however they would approach it or talk about
Yeah.
it. I would love to know more about that.
And that's you look at the international nature and ecumenical nature of, let's say, the Bridges of Meaning Discord server. You don't have a lot of French Catholics. There's a few Quebec Catholics around, but you're right. I mean,
I met one of them
what's that?
due to Bucko. I met one of them due to Buckos in Space, but there are a couple more, and France seems very underrepresented for Europe.
Yes, that's true. Because in some ways we've sort of followed the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, and that's been, pretty much Anglo. I mean, England, Netherlands, Germany.
It's a conversation that happens in English,
Yes.
and these language barriers are really a big deal
Yes.
because it's not just can you speak the language, can you expound philosophically in that language, and can you develop a corpus of knowledge and vocabulary and thoughts in that language. So the more people speak English with all of these things, the more these ideas develop in English and the more they're easy to access. Versus if you're starting in like Spanish or French, you have to redevelop those ideas. You
Yes.
can't, it doesn't work just by interpretation. They have to be thought in the language.
Yes. Yes. And it's interesting that I know Peugeot has done some,
Yeah, he's
some
got
videos in
a
French.
French YouTube channel.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'll listen to it when I want to practice my French a little bit.
but I wouldn't be so. I mean, again, but the difference between France and Quebec. I mean, you got it. You would understand if the those in Quebec were a little bitter about the fact that they got traded for a small Caribbean island that today many people can't even name, in the
Yeah.
in the Great War, the First Great World War.
I love meeting Quebecois because they're North American, but they're francophone, and
Yeah.
so it's this odd clash of this thing. I wish more Quebecois would come to France because they really bring something that the French need. There's a kind of American let's go do it thing that they have that the French could use some more of. Like they'll go live in the woods and they'll go cut wood and they'll go start a business and they'll go do this and go do that, and they connect in a way. It's we had some Quebecois guys in YWAM, and they were all really great.
Wow. So what do you want to see happen in France?
I have grown slow to describe to describe my vision of how I want things to be, especially in a country that I am a guest in.
Yeah, yeah, fair enough.
Because to walk into a guest's house and to say this, you need to be this way, you need to be that way, that is not being a good guest.
Yep, that's true. But yet
And
you're
so,
there.
yes, uh, well, it's difficult to think about this in English. Um, there's a strong cry, of course, there's a strong cry for freedom in France. And
Hmm.
with you'll always see like the big protests, and then the police show up and they gas the protesters, and then they come back and do it a couple weeks later, like perpetually. The way the culture war plays out in France is like it's different than America. Both places are getting how do you say it's shrill. Like there's a shrillness to what's going on, but it's a different kind of shrillness in France. Like there's the Fifth Republic has been around for a while, like since de Gaulle put it in, and people are dissatisfied with it, but they're dissatisfied with society in general, and you can feel the weight. Like there's the it's not just the French state, but like there's this weight, and you can tell that there's this sense of oppression. Maybe that's also what makes it what reminds me of a Muslim country, like this weight of oppression that's sitting on everyone's backs, and everyone wants to throw it off, but no one knows how. It feels less left right than America, but it feels like weighty and heavier. And that whenever I go, I see it and I feel it, and I can sense that there's this strong desire to throw this oppression off and feel freedom. And they don't know what to do, so they protest and they beat up cops, and the cops beat them up, and then that's all anyone can do.
That's not very good.
No, it's not very good. It's not very good.
Wow. That's really interesting.
I,
I
I
don't know.
remember some of the anti-lockdown protests I visited, and it felt like a peasant revolt. Like this is like, oh, I know what a peasant revolt feels like now. These are these are peasants, les paysans, and just like all the people there, it just like the flags they made, and like I can read about European peasant revolts now, and I can picture exactly what's going on. I've my time in France has mostly been in the rural areas and with little people, and I don't know what I don't. I haven't spent tons of time in the middle class or the upper class worlds, and so maybe what I'm describing is more that view of it.
Hmm.
Because it's hard to go into a foreign country and walk into the middle and upper class. That's part of why Christian missionaries are always talking to the least and the poor and the people on the fringes, because the people on the fringes are much more available than people in the center.
Yes.
They're much more willing to sit down with you. And so yeah. And part of me personally, I want to try and move more towards the center and see what I find there.
That's so interesting because I mean, part of what's gone on in American missions, and what I mean by that is missions to America, church planting. I mean, part of what happened in the Tim Keller, John Davidson Hunter, new new urban mission was this desire to move towards the center. And so Tim Keller planted a church in New York City with people who were yuppies, and so there's this whole narrative of redeeming the culture by reclaiming the center, but not in the same way that, let's say, the moral majority or that movement tried. So but you're exactly right about the fringe and the center. The fringe is available. The fringe is almost always available, because basically the way by definition the center is a place of pressure, and people want to get to the center because they know that there's money and power and influence and status. All of those things are in the center, and so
Mm-hmm.
they're willing to pay prices to get into that center. And so there's this big line, there's competition to get to the center, whereas at the fringe there's very little competition to engage the fringe because it's always available. That's a huge insight. And but and so then in North America there was the idea that, well, if Christians can be at the center of power, then Christians can make a difference. by wielding by wielding power, but you have all of those dynamics that Peugeot, I think, speaks very clearly about, in terms of there's always this relationship between the fringe and the center. And it's true that the center has certain kinds of power and influence that are very significant and very visible. The fringe also has its own sort of power and influence, which is less visible and works differently. So, but you're right. And in many ways, when you look at, say, the evangelization of the Roman Empire, a lot of people like to point to the fact that there were slaves and women who became Christian, and that was a big part of the growth of the church. But very quickly, others will chime in and say, yeah, but it also penetrated the center.
They were also in New York City, and it was a New York City religion.
Yes.
They're in Rome itself. Okay, they're the poor people of Rome, but they're in Rome.
Yes. And you find in church history that often prominent women would convert to Christianity. And there is a Christianity in the center, and there is a Christianity in the peripheral. And I think part of, probably, I don't know, maybe some of what you're dealing with in France is that there is a Christianity in the center of France. I mean, Christianity, French culture is deeply Christian in some ways.
Yes.
And so then the question is, you're not adding a novel virus, let's say, to the culture, which
It would be so much easier if we were.
Yes, oh, that's right. You're actually tinkering with, you're trying to wade in with CRISPR and tinker with the DNA of what's already a virus that has come down to them through Christianity.
Yes, in France, it has a very Christian culture, but it has a long and dynamic history of, we could say, secular philosophy.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
And their brain think and that has created an identity, and it's bound up with the idea of the Republic. And this secular space of French society, and I don't know how to deal with it, and I don't know if the Roman Catholics know how to deal with it either, or what to think about it, or how to move forward with it, because like they're all of the brainiac people, all the philosophers, they created these intellectual ideas that existed in the intellectual space, and they occupied intellectual space, and then that intellectual space manifested throughout French culture, and it permeates all of it. So now, like, you have the Christianity and the whatever the other thing is, sitting next to each other and pushing on each other. I don't know if that's. I don't think that's as true for other European countries.
Well, I wonder how it works in Spain.
I wonder that too.
Because, I mean, Spain and France, very different, but both, again, deeply Catholic, both former empires. And I mean, the Spanish Empire was an enormous empire.
And they both don't think in English.
No.
Like in some of the other little European countries, they think in English, and they have intellectual life in English.
Yeah.
But in those countries, their intellectual life is in their own languages.
That's so interesting. Europe, so I've only been to Europe once, just last summer. I found it a fascinating place. It seemed so small and so siloed. And you can see why they had all those wars. I mean, you go to the Netherlands and they're talking trash about the Germans, and they've got all old scores to settle, and yet they're all neighbors and they're all intermarried, and it's like, yeah, I can see why you get a lot of wars.
I was in the Vosges Mountains this summer, and I was looking around, I don't want to get political, but like, Alsace-Lorraine, it makes much more sense for it to be German than it to be French. And like there's this layer of French sitting on top of it, and okay, all the street signs are in French and people are speaking French. But wait a minute, under the surface, this place is really a German state, and probably, and I don't want to say that too loudly, but that was my impression of it. I think the line should be on the watershed, not the river of the Rhine, because it's. But at the same time, it's so hard to imagine Western European countries actually fighting each other now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, and yeah, because you're just driving from one to the other. It's not different from driving from New Jersey to Pennsylvania. Oh, now we're in Pennsylvania. Now we're in Ohio.
Yeah,
Now we're in Michigan. Now we're in Germany.
there 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 are disconnections there, like how like the rail, like there if you're crossing from Germany into France or vice versa, there aren't that many rail connections, and there aren't that many real road connections either.
Huh.
And they do they there's the EU systems, but also there's the national systems, and they don't connect very well. Like there are still real differences, but at the same time, there's also like, okay, we're all watching more or less the same news, the same movies, we're listening to similar music, we're eating similar food, or many of our supply chains are connected. And like, okay, so the Dutch are growing our tomatoes, and then we're getting our oranges from Spain, and it's all connected, and like we're all using the same money, and we hold similar values or like almost the same values. It's hard. It's at the same. It's hard to imagine like, okay, is there ever going to be a real Western European war again,
Yeah,
like along nationalist lines?
yeah, yeah.
Probably not. Hopefully not.
Well, then again, we've got Russia and Ukraine, and 50 years ago, thinking about a Russian-Ukraine war was unimaginable.
Well, 50 years ago, they had a war in the 20s basically, and then they had another war in the 40s where like the Ukrainians, a whole lot of them went over to the Nazi side once the Nazis turned up, and then it was in some ways there was a continuation of the Russian Civil War there. So it feels like that makes more sense in some ways, but also at the same time, this current war between Russia and Ukraine feels so arbitrary and stupid and sad. Like they're all using the same weapons, the same BTRs, the same rifles. They're speaking like a very similar language. They're like basically the same people. It's like the American Civil War. And so in some ways that it feels like this war shouldn't be happening because there's parts of it just feels so arbitrary.
Wow. 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 Well, how do you feel about your Rando slot? Did you get out of it what you
Oh,
wanted to?
yeah, I thought, okay, I'm sort of living in Paul's space, so it'd be nice. It's nice to like, you're sort of like the elder that's out there, but like even when you're not there, you really influence the space a lot. So it's great to be able to sit down and chat with the person. Like in many ways, this Discord server is you providing hospitality to me. So thank you, and not just the server, but like the whole TLC that
Uh,
everyone is being very self-conscious about now.
yeah, yeah. Isn't that a weird thing?
That is so weird. Like I stop being self-conscious. It's okay. Just continue to do the thing and do talky thinky things. The amount of content everyone is producing, like something is going to come of this. I don't know what the results of this place will be, but there are going to be results somewhere down the line.
Yeah,
This
I
much
think so.
energy, this much thought, this much community, this much content that's created, like this stuff does not. Something has to happen. Something is going to. We don't have to worry about
I'm not worried about it. I don't. There's a lot of other people who are, but I'm not. That's
it.
that's why Jacob's angry with me. I'm not
Yeah,
worried at
no.
all.
Oh man. I've noticed
Oh,
that the YouTube algorithm has been pushing like videos with like 100 views that aren't TLC, but like I think it sees because I watch so many videos that are weird and small. YouTube has started like pushing more weird, small, little videos towards me.
here's some weird smallness for you. YouTube doesn't
Yes.
understand the fringe. There's lots of ways to be weird and small. There's more ways to be weird and small than to be at the center.
Yes, yes, this is true.
Well, this was a delight. So you're going to let me
Yes,
share this,
me
right?
too. Yes, yes, please do.
Okay, good, good, good. I had a wonderful Rando's conversation before this one, and I hope she lets me share it too, as these are weird and small, but
Yeah.
they're really blessed, and the world is a very strange place, America included.
It is. I'm here and it's a foreign country to me. So I get to explore it as a foreign country.
Well, I am planning on doing the Q&A this week on Friday and in the
Oh,
Discord.
good.
So you can let everybody know there that that's the plan. I should have probably announced it before now. Maybe I'll post this today and then I
Okay.
would know that people would know. But yeah, so
Okay. Maybe I'll post something somewhere.
all right. I appreciate it.
Okay. Thank
Thanks a
you.
lot.
Have a great day.
All right, you too. Bye-bye.